6 in the evening on Market Street, in the middle of the rush-hour crowd, an old man stood frozen at a corner grocery, his hand trembling as it searched for a wallet that was no longer there. The shop owner snatched the bag of groceries back and shouted that he was a beggar, that old men like him should stay off the street instead of wasting people's time. That one look at him was enough to know nobody at home cared whether he lived or died. The old man said quietly that his wallet had just been taken, that his son would be there any minute. Not one person believed him. The whole block stood and watched. Some raised their phones to film. Some turned their faces away and kept walking. A few steps down the sidewalk, a delivery girl pulled her bike over. In her bag was the last package of her shift, a set of documents that had to reach a building across the river before 6:30, the one thing standing between her and losing her job. She looked at her watch. Then she set the bike down, walked up to the counter, laid every last dollar she had on it, and told the shop owner that no one deserved to be humiliated over a bag of groceries. The man went silent. The old man was shaking from the cold and could not remember his own son's phone number. She took off her work jacket, put it around his shoulders, flagged down a taxi, and pressed her last few coins into the driver's hand before she walked away. All of it cost her 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes cost her the job that same afternoon. What she did not know was that the black car pulling up to the curb 30 seconds later belonged to the most powerful man in the city. And what she could never have imagined was that the 20 minutes she had just given away would hand back to her something that had been taken from her 20 years ago, something she never even knew she once had. If this story touched you, leave a like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories still to come. The stone steps were cold, but the old man sat down without uttering a single complaint. Marin held his elbow until he was completely steady before letting go. His hands were still trembling, so she took one of them in hers, rubbed it gently 2 or 3 times to warm it, then unbuttoned her own coat, draped it over his shivering shoulders, and asked whether there was anyone he wanted her to call. He nodded, then shook his head. His wallet and phone had been in the same pocket, and the pickpocket had taken them both at once. His son's number was stored only in the phone, and he'd never once had to remember it in more than 10 years. He said this with a trace of embarrassment in his voice, like a man who had suddenly realized he'd lived so long under someone else's care that he'd forgotten how to manage on his own. Marin told him it was all right, that everyone was like that these days, and that she couldn't even remember her own sister's number. He laughed, a dry, brief sound, then asked her name. She told him her name was Marin. She asked for his in return. He said people called him Enzo, and there was something in the way he said it that made her think no one had asked him that question in a very long time. She glanced at the watch on her wrist, then at the stream of traffic packed tightly across the road, and she understood what was coming. But she stayed another minute, because he still hadn't stopped trembling. He told her to go, that he'd be fine sitting there, that his son would find him, because his son always found him. Marin said she'd leave as soon as she saw him safely inside a car. Then she stood, stepped to the edge of the street, hailed a taxi, and opened the rear door for him. As she helped him toward it, he suddenly stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, turned to her, and asked whether she might give him her phone number. She hesitated. He spoke at once, his voice gentle, as though he were afraid she might misunderstand, saying he didn't mean anything by it, only that at his age, a person learned one thing, that there were very few people in this world willing to stop for a stranger, and if the day ever came when he needed someone like that again, he wanted to know whom he should call. Marin was silent for a few seconds. Then she tore a piece from the wrapping paper inside her parcel bag, braced it against her knee, hurriedly wrote down her number with the ballpoint pen she used when customers signed for deliveries, and handed it to him. He took the scrap of paper in both hands, folded it into quarters, then slipped it into his breast pocket, with the care of someone putting away a ticket that could never be bought again. He said, "Thank you, child," and she told him to get home and rest. She closed the car door, gave the driver the last of her loose change, told him to take the old man all the way home, then turned and ran toward the motorcycle parked beside the base of a lamppost. She didn't look back. She didn't see the taxi move barely half a turn of its wheels before it had to stop, nor did she see the black sport utility vehicle pull up to the curb exactly 30 seconds later. She didn't see the 2 men step out, open the taxi door, and address the old man by a title that made the driver gently press her loose change back into the old man's hand and refuse to take a single cent for the ride. The security detail had spent half an hour walking the exact route the old man had followed for years, questioning every vendor and every newspaper seller, and they found him exactly 20 minutes too late. exactly 20 minutes for which someone else had just paid the price in their place. As the black vehicle pulled away, the old man raised a hand and pressed it against his breast pocket, where the scrap of paper folded into quarters rested, and he kept his hand there for the entire journey home. The bridge spanning the river was jammed solid for an entire kilometer, and Marin threaded her motorcycle between two rows of motionless cars that sat like blocks of cold iron, one hand pressing the horn as her eyes kept darting toward the clock on the phone, mounted to the handlebars. 6:27, 6:31, 6:40, 6:52. By the time she braked sharply in front of the glass building on the other side of the river, nearly all the lights in the ground floor corridor had been switched off. Only the yellow lamp at the reception desk remained, and the glass doors were locked. She pounded her palm against the glass, called inside, and held up the document package so the security guard could see it. He came forward, looked at her, looked at the package, then shook his head and pointed to the notice posted inside. Bids would be accepted until 6:30. Nothing would be accepted after the deadline. He added that someone from the contracting office had waited in the lobby until 6:35, made a phone call somewhere, then left. There was no reproach in his voice, only the tone of a man reporting something that had already happened and couldn't be changed. Marin stood there with the package still clutched against her chest, her breathing not yet steady. She was 22 minutes late. At 9 o'clock that evening, the client emailed Keystone Courier to cancel its delivery contract, adding one brief sentence that said they had lost the bid and didn't need an explanation. At 10 o'clock, Marin's phone vibrated with a single message from Curtis Mabry, the dispatch manager, ordering her to report to the depot at 7 the following morning. She slept for perhaps 3 hours. At 7 o'clock, inside the cramped dispatch office, thick with the smell of cardboard and cold coffee, Curtis didn't invite her to sit down. He asked whether she knew how much that contract was worth each year. She said she did. He asked where she had been while the package was supposed to be lying on someone's desk. Marin opened her mouth, then closed it again. She thought of the cold stone steps, the trembling hand held inside her own, and the scrap of paper folded into quarters in the breast pocket of an old man she would never see again. She understood that if she told Curtis what had happened, it would become nothing more than an excuse in his ears, and an excuse would sound even worse than silence. She said she had been late, and it was her fault. Curtis nodded as though those were the exact words he had been waiting to hear, so there would be no need for an argument. He pulled out the termination notice he had already printed the night before, pushed it across the desk for her to sign, then informed her that the $600 vehicle deposit she had paid when she started working there would be withheld to cover the company's losses, along with her 2 weeks of unpaid wages. Marin asked only one question: whether those 2 weeks of wages were payment for deliveries she had already completed. Curtis said they were, but he had no other choice. The company had just lost a major client, and someone had to bear the cost. She looked at him for another few seconds, then picked up the pen and signed. She didn't offer a single word in her defense. She took the second uniform jacket from her personal locker, folded it, and placed it on the desk. Then she removed her employee badge and pushed the locker key toward him. When she reached the depot gate, she stopped beneath the corrugated metal awning for a moment and counted the money left in her wallet. It wasn't enough to do anything except fill the gas tank of the motorcycle she no longer had to ride for work after today. She didn't regret the 20 minutes she had lost the day before. She simply didn't know what she was going to tell Darlene that evening. All morning, she went to 4 places that were hiring and filled out 4 applications. At the third one, they asked why she had left her previous job. She told the truth. They thanked her, then slipped her application beneath the rest of the stack. By noon, the weather had turned cold, and only then did Marin remember that the only coat she had left was now resting on the shoulders of some old man on the other side of the city. The porch light was still burning at the rented house in Kensington, and Marin knew it wasn't because anyone was waiting for her, but because no one had bothered to turn it off for the past 3 months. She had barely pushed open the door, and hadn't even had time to set her bag on the chair when Darlene asked where the money was. Not how was your day, not why are you home so late, not have you eaten yet. Just those 3 words, called out from the kitchen in the same voice that had asked them exactly that way for 7 years, ever since Mr. Ray passed away, the only person in that house who had ever saved her a plate of food and remembered her birthday. Marin said she'd lost her job. Darlene came out of the kitchen, still holding a dish towel, and stood looking at her for a long moment, as if recalculating a sum that had suddenly lost one of its numbers. Then she asked what she'd been fired for. Marin said she'd delivered a package late. Darlene asked how late. She said 22 minutes. Darlene threw the towel onto the table and said, 22 minutes. You lost your job over 22 minutes, while people are out there knocking on the door of this house. Marin asked who had been knocking. Darlene didn't answer immediately. She went straight into the back room, came out with a printed document bearing a seal and a string of numbers, placed it on the dining table, and only then spoke the amount aloud to make certain Marin heard it clearly. $40,000. Wyatt owed $40,000. He hadn't borrowed it to start a business or pay for medical treatment. It was money he had lost entirely in rooms Marin had never once entered. Darlene said they had come to the house twice. The first time, they had stood outside the gate and spoken politely. The second time, they had walked all the way onto the porch and sat down in the wicker chair. Marin asked where Wyatt was. Darlene said he was hiding at a friend's house, and she said it in the voice of a mother explaining that her son had gone away on business. Marin stood there, staring at the paper, and she understood at once that they hadn't called her home to discuss anything. They had called her home to inform her of what had already been decided. Sure enough, Darlene pulled out a chair and sat across from her, lowering her voice as though she were about to share good news. She said she'd already found a way out, that Mr. Gordon Pike had agreed to pay the entire debt at once, with no interest, no promissory note, and no one coming to knock on their door again. Marin asked what he wanted in return. Darlene said that in return, Marin would go live with him. Marin asked again, slowly, one word at a time, to make certain she hadn't heard wrong, and Darlene repeated it exactly, adding that he owned 3 rental properties and a pawn shop, that he'd promised to provide her with everything she needed, that she was 21 years old, and no longer some foolish young girl, and that these days, countless women could only dream of receiving such an offer. Marin asked her just one question. If Wyatt were the one being told to go live with Mr. Pike, would she be sitting there speaking to him in that same voice? Darlene fell silent. Then she said Wyatt was her own flesh and blood. The words fell onto the table and lay there without moving. Marin nodded and said that Darlene had given her answer, and she wasn't going anywhere. Darlene sprang to her feet and said Marin owed that household 20 years of food, clothing, and shelter. That without her, Marin would have ended up lost in some forgotten corner of the world, and now that the family needed her for once, she was turning her back on them. Marin said she'd already repaid it, with every month's wages, every electric bill, and every time she'd paid the rent in Wyatt's place. She would keep paying if money was what they needed, but she wouldn't pay with herself. Darlene's hand flew up, and the sound of the slap rang sharply through the little kitchen. Marin didn't step back or raise a hand to shield herself. She merely stood still for a few more seconds, then turned and went into her room, pulled the canvas bag from beneath the bed, and stuffed inside a few changes of clothes, her vocational school diploma, her wallet, and the notebook containing the delivery routes that, as of that day, no longer served any purpose. When she passed through the kitchen, Darlene was still standing in the same spot, calling after her that if she walked out that door, she should never come back. Marin didn't answer. She pulled open the door, and the sound of it closing behind her was the last sound that came from that house that night. Outside, the wind had shifted, and she walked past the row of low houses toward the bus stop with the canvas bag over her shoulder. A little more than $40 in her jacket pocket, and not a single address in her mind. She sat down on the bench beneath the bus shelter, pulled up her collar, and for the first time that day, allowed herself to tremble. In Chestnut Hill, the light in the second-floor study burned well past midnight, and 2 men stood before Raphael Barbieri's desk for nearly an hour, without being permitted to sit. Rafe didn't shout. He'd never needed to. He merely went over each point in the timeline again. Who had let the old man out of the vehicle, and where had they been standing when he turned onto that stretch of street? At what minute had the 2 of them realized they'd lost sight of him? During the half-hour that followed, had neither of them thought to split up and question every vendor along the street where he regularly stopped? The older of the 2 men said the old man had asked to walk alone. Rafe said his father made that request every week, and their job wasn't to obey him. He removed them from his father's personal security detail and reassigned them to the warehouses, delivering the decision in a voice so calm that they both understood it was the lightest punishment they could have received. When the door closed behind them, Enzo spoke from the armchair in the corner, where he'd sat silently from the beginning, and said his son had been too harsh. Rafe said his father had been pickpocketed in the middle of the street, left without money or a phone, and no one had known where he was for 20 minutes. Enzo replied that during those 20 minutes, he hadn't been alone. Then he told him what had happened. He spoke slowly, without embellishment, and what he described most wasn't the bag of parcels or the taxi, but the way the young woman had sat down on the steps beside him and rubbed his hands to warm them, the way she'd said, "It's all right, sir," when he felt ashamed that he couldn't remember his own son's number, and the way she'd waited until he was safely inside the taxi before allowing herself to leave, even though he knew perfectly well that she was already late. Throughout the telling, he kept the scrap of wrapping paper folded into quarters in his hand, occasionally unfolding it before carefully folding it again. Rafe looked at the paper and said he'd have someone bring her a sum of money the next day, several times what she'd spent, and that would settle the matter. Enzo said he didn't want the matter settled. Rafe told his father not to let a stranger into their home simply because she'd been kind to him for precisely 20 minutes. Because the city was full of people capable of kindness for precisely 20 minutes when they knew who they were being kind to. Enzo remained silent for a long while. Then, in a very soft voice, he asked whether Rafe was still searching for that little girl. Rafe didn't answer. Enzo continued, saying he'd seen the file on his son's desk. He'd seen the name of that hospital, and he'd counted that this was now the 20th year. Rafe rose, walked to the window, and said he'd made a promise. He'd made it to himself when he was 14 years old, on the night they took his father away and left him standing in the corridor of St. Brigid's Hospital, and he'd kept that promise longer than any other promise he'd ever made. Enzo asked why, after 20 years, the search still hadn't led anywhere. Rafe said it was because that night, the child had been admitted under the name of a guardian whose identity no one had ever been able to verify, and because the records of minors were sealed by law and couldn't be opened with money or influence. He added that St. Brigid's entire paper archive had lain untouched in the basement all those years, and they hadn't begun digitizing it until the year before. Enzo asked whether that meant she could be found now. Rafe said it meant that only now was there something to search. At that exact moment, Angelo Rizzo knocked and entered. He didn't speak immediately, but glanced at Enzo before looking toward Rafe, the look of a man weighing whether he should say what he knew in front of a third person. Rafe told him to go ahead. Angelo said a rumor was circulating, still unverified and so far only being whispered through their circles, that the Hollis family appeared to have found their long-lost daughter, that a test had already been conducted, and that they were preparing some kind of gathering. No one in the room said another word. Enzo looked at his son. Rafe set his glass of water on the desk, and he rose to his feet. Marin's phone vibrated in her coat pocket at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, while she was still sitting at the bus stop with the canvas bag wedged between her knees, and she almost didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. The voice on the other end asked whether this was Marin, then said he was Enzo, the old man from that afternoon, and apologized for calling so late. She told him it was all right. He asked whether she was safe, and Marin remained silent a little too long enough for a man of 76 to understand the answer. He read her an address in Chestnut Hill and said he wouldn't presume to ask anything of her. He only wanted her to come, and if she didn't wish to, he wouldn't trouble her again. 40 minutes later, Marin stepped off the bus at the foot of a hill, walked along the row of numbered houses, then stopped before an iron gate twice her height. She checked the address on her phone, checked it once more, and thought she must have misheard one of the numbers. She turned around and had taken 3 steps when the gate slid open, and the butler came down, called her by name, and said Mr. Enzo was waiting for her. She stood motionless for a moment before crossing that threshold. Enzo received her in the family room at the back of the house, not in the grand living room, and he poured her a glass of warm milk before asking her anything. He didn't ask why she'd been sitting at a bus stop at 1 o'clock in the morning with a canvas bag, and Marin was grateful to him for that. She merely said she'd lost her job, and he merely nodded. Then he told her she would stay there for the night. There was an empty guest room, and in the morning she could go wherever she wished. Marin refused twice. The third time, he didn't try to persuade her. He simply said that at his age, a man didn't like watching someone walk out into the cold at 2 o'clock in the morning, and she had no answer left. That night, Marin slept straight through until morning. No one knocked on the door. No one called her name to ask for money. There was no sound of Wyatt's key turning in the lock when he came home at 4 in the morning. She awoke at 7 and needed several seconds to remember where she was. A housemaid invited her downstairs for breakfast, and when Marin entered the dining room, a man was already seated at the head of the table, wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, an untouched cup of coffee before him, Enzo introduced him as his son. The man looked up at her, and Marin recognized his face. She'd seen it on the front page of a financial newspaper someone had left behind at the depot, beneath a headline about the Port of Delaware. Raphael Barbieri. She placed a hand on the edge of the chair, and in that single instant, she understood whose house this was, and why a black vehicle had come for the old man the day before. Rafe thanked her for what she'd done that afternoon, briefly and politely, the kind of thanks offered by a man who wanted to bring a matter to an end. He said he'd arranged for her to receive a sum of money in compensation. Marin said she wouldn't accept it. Rafe asked why. She said she hadn't helped the old man for money, and if she accepted it now, it would mean she'd done what she did yesterday for money after all. Rafe studied her a little longer. Enzo set down his teacup and said, with perfect calm, "You're going to marry Marin." The entire table fell silent. Marin thought she'd misheard him. Rafe told his father to say that again. Enzo repeated his words exactly. Rafe gave a single answer. No. He said he would repay Miss Marin in any way she wished, with money, a job, or an apartment. But his father mustn't turn marriage into a token of gratitude for her, and he mustn't turn it into one for him either. Enzo said he had 3 reasons. First, the council had met 3 times that year, and all 3 meetings had concerned the same issue, that the head of this family was 34 years old, and had given people nothing to make them believe he intended to remain in his place for the long term, and Enzo knew what the people in that room were preparing. Second, he raised a hand to the left side of his chest, and said the doctor had given him a number. He had no intention of speaking that number at the breakfast table, but it wouldn't wait as long as his son believed. Third, he took the scrap of paper folded into quarters from his pocket, placed it on the table between them, and said that the 20 minutes from the day before were a debt he didn't wish to carry into his grave. Marin stood. She thanked him for the previous night, and for the breakfast she hadn't yet touched, then said that whatever the 2 men were discussing had nothing to do with her, and she wouldn't sit there while people arranged her life for her yet again within the span of 2 days. She picked up her bag and had taken exactly 4 steps toward the door. Before Marin could leave, Rafe spoke. He asked only one question, whether Gordon Pike knew where to find her. Marin stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood there with one hand still gripping the strap of her bag, while a thought flashed swiftly through her mind. This man had known her for less than 10 minutes, yet he already knew a name she herself hadn't heard for the first time until the night before. She turned and asked how long he'd known. Rafe said since around 4 o'clock that morning. He added that when his father picked up the phone and called a stranger at 1 o'clock in the morning, then by 4 o'clock, he needed to know who that stranger was. That was how he lived, and he wouldn't apologize for it. Then, he pushed a printed sheet of paper toward her. Marin recognized the string of numbers immediately because she'd spent the entire previous evening staring at them on Darlene's kitchen table. Rafe said the debt of $40,000 had been paid in full the previous afternoon. Gordon Pike had paid it. He added that the transaction had been completed before dinner, which meant that, by the time everyone sat down at the kitchen table to ask for her consent, the money had already changed hands long before, and the so-called request for her consent had been nothing more than a formality. He asked where she planned to go that morning. Marin said she would find somewhere. He asked how long that would take with a little more than $40 in her wallet and a dismissal on her record for costing her former company a contract. She said nothing. She wanted to argue, but she realized that every argument led back to the same place. She had nowhere to go, and the man standing before her had known it before she did. Rafe said he didn't like what his father had just proposed, but he didn't like being forced into a position where he had no control either, and of those 2 things, the second concerned him more. He told her plainly that he needed a name beside his own for the next 12 months, not because of any feelings, but because 3 other families were waiting to see whether he had a weakness, and in their eyes, a man with nothing to lose was a man who could easily be cornered. Then he laid out his terms one by one, as clearly as though he were reading a shipping contract. 1 year. A public and legally registered marriage, complete with an announcement and photographs in the newspapers, because if it were kept secret, it would serve none of his purposes. Inside the house, each of them would have a separate room, and neither would cross the other's boundaries. She wouldn't ask anything about his work, wouldn't listen, wouldn't look, and wouldn't repeat anything. At the end of the year, they would both sign the papers ending the marriage. She would leave, and he wouldn't try to stop her. Marin asked what she would receive. Rafe said she would receive peace. No one would ever knock on her door again. No one would ever be able to sell her to anyone again. and with the name Barbieri behind hers, Mr. Pike wouldn't dare speak of her a second time for the rest of his life. Marin asked whether there was anything else. He said there was one more thing. He didn't trust her. He said he'd met more than a few people who'd been kind to him once, only to return later and demand repayment. Some demanded money. Others demanded a place beside him. His father trusted her, but he didn't, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise merely to please him. Marin nodded. She said she didn't need him to trust her either. She needed only one thing from him. He must never hand her money and call it a gift. She would find her own job and pay her own share, and on the day she walked out through those gates, she wanted to leave with exactly the same amount of property she'd brought inside. Rafe looked at her for a moment, then agreed. At the far end of the table, Enzo set down his teacup without saying a word. 3 days later, everything was completed in 10 minutes inside a small registry office downtown. There were no flowers, no guests, and no music. The terms were read aloud, the two of them signed, and the official stamped the documents. Angelo stood at the door watching the corridor, while a representative from the law office held a prepared statement that would be sent to the press that same afternoon. As Marin put pen to paper, she noticed that her hand wasn't trembling, and that was what frightened her most. When Rafe finished signing, he closed his pen and told the representative from the law office that the announcement was to be released before 6 o'clock that evening. Then he turned to Marin and told her the car was waiting downstairs. In that entire room, only one person smiled that day. It was Enzo, seated in the last row, with both hands resting on his cane, looking at the 2 children he'd just bound together with a debt of 20 minutes. Marin moved into the Barbieri house with nothing but the canvas bag she'd carried on the night she left Kensington, and the butler had to ask a second time whether there was any other luggage still in the car. On her first evening, she was handed a sheet listing the monthly allowance provided to the wife of the head of the family, along with a bank card that hadn't yet been activated. She read the amount, then pushed both items back and said she wouldn't use them. The butler was so bewildered that he had to go upstairs and ask Rafe what he should do. The following morning, when she was informed that a private driver was already waiting to take her anywhere she wished to go, Marin refused that as well. Instead, she asked whether any of the family's companies needed workers. Rafe asked what she intended to do. She said she knew how to work. She'd spent 4 years making deliveries. She knew how to read shipping manifests. She knew the routes. And she knew which roads became congested at which hours. She had no intention of sitting in a house she hadn't contributed anything toward. He studied her for a moment, then told Angelo to arrange an entry-level position for her in the dispatch department at Barbieri Freight, with the same salary as every other new employee, not $1 more. He said it as though it were a test, and Marin understood that it was a test, and she accepted. Privately, Rafe gave her 3 weeks at most. He'd seen every kind of person walk into houses like this one, and they always began by refusing everything. Then, in the 2nd week, they asked about the car. In the 3rd, they asked about the bank card. By the 2nd month, the butler would come upstairs to report that the dressing room was full. He waited for that to happen. It didn't. Marin woke at 6 o'clock, took the train down to the port on her own, ate a boxed lunch from the cafeteria like everyone else, and returned home after 7 every evening. No one in the department knew who she was because the announcement released on the day the papers were signed had included only her name, not her photograph, and the dock workers didn't read the financial pages. On her 3rd day, she stayed behind alone after work with a stack of shipping manifests from the previous 6 months for the route running from the Delaware warehouse to 3 distribution centers in the north. She didn't find it through software or accounting expertise, because she had no accounting expertise. She found it because she'd spent 4 years driving those exact roads. She knew there were only 2 ways to get from the Delaware warehouse to the first delivery point, and neither route could possibly take 4 hours at midday, no matter how severe the traffic became. She pulled out 21 manifests, showing a travel time of 4 hours. Every one of them fell on a weekday. Every one had been signed by the same group of drivers. And on every trip, the volume of goods received at the destination was slightly lower than the amount that had left the warehouse. Just little enough to remain within the permitted margin of loss, just little enough that no one had bothered to ask a question. She added up the discrepancy from all 6 months, and the final number left her sitting motionless before the screen for a long while. The next morning, she took the file to the department manager, who glanced through it and told her that a new employee should focus on doing a new employee's work. Marin carried it back downstairs, typed everything into 2 concise pages, and sent them to Angelo with a single line saying that if the matter was already known, he should please disregard her message. Angelo sent people down to the port that very afternoon. Late that night, he knocked on the door of Rafe's study with the papers in his hand and said she was right. He said that route had been systematically drained for 6 months, that the value of the missing freight amounted to nearly 2 months of profit for the entire Delaware warehouse, and that the method had been so precise that the accounting department had approved 6 consecutive reporting periods without anyone raising a single question. Rafe asked where the money had gone. Angelo said most of it had been divided into smaller amounts and transferred through a series of accounts. And the final point they'd traced was an intermediary account in the name of a service company in Wilmington. No one had looked any further yet, because their immediate priority was dealing with the drivers and the warehouse shift supervisor. Rafe nodded and told him to finish handling that part first. Then he picked up the 2 pages Marin had typed, read them again from the beginning, and sat in silence for a very long time. There wasn't a single plea in those 2 pages, not one line mentioning that the person who'd written them was living in his house, not one word intended to make certain he knew the discovery belonged to her. He'd prepared himself for a demanding woman. In his mind, he'd already formed every answer to everything a woman like that might ask of him. But she asked for nothing, and he didn't know what to do with that. That evening, the rain began falling at 5 o'clock and never let up. The train line to the port stopped running because the middle section of the route had flooded, and Marin stood beneath the awning of the warehouse for nearly 40 minutes before Rafe's car pulled up. He didn't say much. He simply opened the rear door and told her to get in. Marin said she was already soaked through, that she would ruin the seats if she got inside, and that she'd rather wait a little longer to see whether the train started running again. Rafe told her to get in a second time, and this time he said nothing more. Marin saw that Rafe was losing patience, and feared that she would cut into his time to rest, so she reluctantly climbed into the car. They'd been driving for about 10 minutes, when the heating system made a sharp, dry sound and shut down completely. Angelo, seated behind the wheel, said he'd reported it for maintenance that morning, but no one had gotten around to repairing it yet. The car gradually grew colder. Marin sat with her back straight, and both hands pressed between her knees, trying not to let anyone see that her shoulders were trembling. Rafe glanced at her, then removed his overcoat and draped it around her shoulders without a word and without waiting for her to refuse. She started to take it off. Then she didn't. The coat was still warm, and within its folds lingered a scent unlike any other. Dried orange peel mingled with stale cigarette smoke, a scent she guessed had clung to it from this car, and from all the long evenings he'd spent sitting inside it. Marin closed her eyes, and in that exact moment, something stirred to life inside her mind. It wasn't an image or a face, only a voice. The voice of a boy whose voice was still changing, hoarse and urgent, speaking very close to her ear and telling her, "Don't fall asleep." That was all. There was nothing before it, and nothing after it. Marin opened her eyes, her heart pounding so violently that she had to draw a deep breath. She couldn't understand why those 3 words had caught in her throat. She turned toward the window and looked outside, where the rain streamed in long trails down the clouded glass, and tears slipped from her eyes without warning, without preparation, and without any reason she could have given if someone had asked. She raised a hand and wiped them away quickly, then wiped them away again. Rafe saw her. He saw everything, from the moment she closed her eyes, to the moment her shoulders stiffened, to the moment she turned her face away. He didn't ask. He didn't ask whether she was all right, whether it was because she was cold, or whether someone at work had done something to her. He merely told Angelo to stop at a roadside diner and buy her something hot to drink, then turned his face toward the window on his side. No one said anything else for the rest of the drive. Marin clutched the edges of the coat tightly around her shoulders, and she didn't take it off until the car reached the gates. That night, she lay awake for a very long time, trying to summon the voice in her mind again, trying to remember who it belonged to, trying to find a name, a face, a room, anything at all. But it was gone, leaving behind only the cold sensation in her fingertips, and one thing she knew with absolute certainty, that someone, somewhere, a very long time ago, had once told her not to fall asleep. The invitation to the Barbieri house arrived at the end of that week, and Rafe handed it to Marin at the breakfast table, explaining that the Hollis family was hosting a fundraising gala and that, by custom, his wife should be there. Marin looked at the invitation, then said she would rather not go. She explained that the dispatch department was closing its books for the month that week, and since she hadn't been there long, it wouldn't look right for her to take time off. She said it in such an ordinary voice that Rafe had nothing to challenge. He didn't press her. He simply said, "All right," then folded the invitation. The truth was that Maren had seen the name Hollis across the newspapers for the past 2 weeks, and she knew the entire city would be watching that ballroom tonight. She understood that her place wasn't beneath those lights. That evening, she came home late as usual, ate alone in the kitchen, then went upstairs to her room. Close to 11 o'clock, she turned on the television, and the late news opened with that very story. Arthur Hollis stood at the podium with a microphone in his hand, his voice trembling through the first half of his opening sentence before growing steady. He said that 20 years ago, his family had lost a daughter, that not one day had passed in those 20 years when they'd stopped searching for her, and that tonight, he could tell everyone their daughter had come home. Margaret stood beside him, her hand clutching her husband's arm. Then the test results appeared on the screen, bearing the hospital's name and a doctor's signature, and the camera moved toward a young woman standing between them. She wore a cream-colored dress, her hair was swept into a neat bun, and her eyes were red with tears. The news anchor read her name, Cecilia Hollis, and said she'd grown up under the name Sienna Vaughn. The camera captured the faces in the ballroom as well, and Maren saw Rafe standing in the second row. He wasn't applauding. He simply stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the woman at the podium. Maren watched for exactly 3 seconds, then turned off the television. She sat in the darkness for a long time. She remembered the clause she herself had read and signed less than 2 months earlier. 12 months. When they ended, they would sign the papers terminating the marriage. She would leave, and he wouldn't stop her. She thought perhaps it wouldn't take 12 months after all. At the ballroom, Rafe waited until most of the guests had gone before asking the Hollis family for a few minutes alone with the woman. They were shown into a small room in the back. He didn't waste time. He said he was happy for her, then asked whether she remembered the summer at the lake house. Sienna said she did. She remembered the wooden dock and the little blue boat. He asked whether she remembered his family's dog. She said she did. His name was Bruno, and he used to follow them all the way down to the water. She added that he was afraid of thunder and would crawl beneath a chair whenever rain was coming. Rafe continued, asking about the tin box they'd once buried beneath a tree, the song her mother used to play in the car, and even the time he'd been punished for letting her climb onto the roof of the shed. Sienna answered every question. She didn't miss a single one. Her answers came quickly and completely, filled with details, even details he himself had forgotten and only remembered when she mentioned them. And that was precisely what stirred something uneasy in a place deep inside him. He'd read enough case files to know that when someone had endured trauma and lived with memory loss for years, recollections usually came with hesitation. The order was often confused. Colors and names were often remembered incorrectly. A person would often stop midway through an answer, shake their head, and say they weren't sure. She didn't pause once. She spoke smoothly, like someone reciting notes she'd committed to memory. Rafe remained silent for several seconds after her final answer. Sienna looked at him, her eyes filling with tears again, and said that for 20 years, she'd remembered only fragments. It was only recently, after being reunited with her parents, that so much of it had begun to return. She said she'd been afraid to speak about it because people might accuse her of making it all up. Then she asked whether he believed her. And Rafe, who'd spent 20 years searching for a name, who'd kept one promise longer than any other promise in his life, who only the day before had sat before a sealed hospital file he couldn't bring himself to open, looked into her eyes and said that he believed her. He said the words knowing perfectly well that he wanted to believe her. He also knew that wanting to believe and believing were two different things. But that night, he chose not to distinguish between them. Wyatt called on a Tuesday afternoon while Maren was standing in the port parking lot checking shipping manifests, and he began in the familiar tone she'd heard no fewer than 20 times in her life. He asked how she was doing. He said he'd seen her name in the newspaper. Then he got to the point, saying that although the old debt had been settled, he was still caught up in a few minor obligations elsewhere. It was only $15,000, and for someone in her position now, that was nothing. Maren said she didn't have it. He laughed and told her not to joke. She said she wasn't joking, that she worked for a salary like everyone else, that she'd never taken a single dollar from that family, and that even if she had the money, she still wouldn't give it to him, because $15,000 today would become $30,000 next month. Wyatt's voice changed within a second. He said that now that she was sitting high above everyone else, she'd forgotten everything, that his mother had raised her for 20 years. Then, before hanging up, he left her with one final warning. She'd better watch herself, because this family knew who she was. Marin stood watching the screen slowly go dark. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she felt cold. 3 days later, Darlene's number appeared on her phone at nearly 9 o'clock that evening. The person calling wasn't Darlene, but an unfamiliar woman who introduced herself as a neighbor. She said Mrs. Doyle had fallen in the kitchen, that she was lying there refusing to go to the hospital, and that she kept calling Marin's name. The woman said she was very weak, and that Marin needed to come home immediately. Marin asked how she'd fallen, and whether anyone had called an ambulance, but the woman answered evasively and ended the call. Marin stood in the middle of the room for a while. On the night she'd walked out of that house, she'd made herself one promise, that she would never go back. But whatever else that woman might be, she was still the person who'd taken Marin in and raised her when Marin couldn't even remember her own name, and Marin had never learned how to abandon someone who was lying helpless. She called a taxi and left. She didn't tell anyone in the house. What she didn't know was that every day since she'd signed the papers, a car had been parked 2 blocks from her workplace, and the person inside had been assigned to record where she went, what time she returned, and whom she met. Rafe had given that order during the very first week and hadn't said a word to her about it, partly because he still didn't trust her, and partly because he knew that if he told her, she would refuse just as she'd refused the driver and the bank card. At 9:20 that evening, one of Angelo's men called to report that she'd just taken a taxi toward Kensington. At 9:35, Angelo called Rafe. At 9:37, Rafe got into his car. The porch light at the house in Kensington was glowing as it always did. Marin pushed open the door and found Darlene sitting at the dining table, completely unharmed, both hands resting on its surface. She didn't stand. She merely said, "So, you came home." There was a stack of papers on the table, and seated at the far end was Gordon Pike, a man Marin had seen exactly twice in her life, and on both occasions he'd been watching her. He rose, pulled out a chair, and invited her to sit. Then he said he'd been waiting a long time for this. Marin didn't sit. She asked where her mother had fallen. Darlene said she hadn't fallen, and there wasn't a trace of shame in her voice. Pike pushed the stack of papers toward Marin. He said the $40,000 had been repaid long ago, that he wasn't asking for a single dollar back, that he'd signed every required document, and that now he only needed her to fulfill her part. Marin said she already had a family. Pike said he knew, and he smiled as he said it. He told her that those marriages made on paper could be signed at any time and torn apart just as easily, then asked how long she thought those people would keep her there. She stepped back and realized that the rear door had been bolted. At that exact moment, the front door swung open. Rafe walked inside, past Darlene without so much as looking at her, went straight to Marin, and placed himself between her and Pike. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Gordon Pike and said only one thing: "She isn't merchandise for anyone to sell." Pike opened his mouth to speak about the money. Rafe didn't wait for him to finish. 2 of Angelo's men entered from behind and escorted Pike out through the door. The door closed. What happened outside afterward isn't part of this story. In the kitchen, there was only the ticking of the clock on the wall. Darlene remained seated exactly where she was, and Rafe turned to Marin and asked whether she was all right. She shook her head. He said they were going home. They'd reached the gate before she asked how he'd known she was there, and Rafe told her the truth without concealing a single word. It was nearly midnight by the time they arrived home, and only when Marin sat down in a chair in the family room did she notice the red mark rising across her left wrist, where Pike had grabbed her as she backed toward the rear door. Rafe had someone bring up the first aid kit, then tended to her himself without calling anyone else. He pulled a chair over and sat across from her, rested her hand on his knee, cleaned the reddened skin with antiseptic-soaked cotton, then wrapped a thin layer of gauze around it. He worked slowly and said nothing. Marin looked down at his hands and knew it was now or never. She told him she'd lied to him. Rafe didn't look up. She went on, telling him that when they'd asked about her next of kin in the registry office, she'd left the space blank, that she'd allowed both him and the old man to believe she had no one left, when the truth was that she wasn't an orphan. She said the woman sitting at the dinner table tonight was the woman who'd raised her for 20 years, and she was also the very same woman who'd just accepted money to hand her over to a 61-year-old man. She said this was the second time. The first had been the night she walked out of that house carrying her canvas bag, and she'd kept silent about it because she thought that if she told him, he would see her as being just like them. Another burden that came with complications, another name that would one day arrive with a bill attached. When she finished, She sat quietly and waited. She'd prepared herself for his anger. She'd even anticipated the exact words he would say, that he'd told her from the beginning he didn't trust her, and that she'd just proved him right. Rafe tied off the end of the bandage, lowered her hand, and only then looked up. He didn't reproach her with a single word. He simply said he knew. He told her his men had reconstructed every detail of her life by the second night. That he knew the woman's name, knew about the $40,000, and had known even before he stopped her in the breakfast room that morning. He said he hadn't mentioned it because it was her story to tell, and he'd been waiting to see how long it would take her to tell him herself. Then he added one short sentence without raising his voice. There wouldn't be another time. He said he didn't need her to promise him anything. From now on, if anyone called and asked her to go somewhere at 9 o'clock at night, she was to pick up the phone and call him first. That was all. Maren nodded. She lowered her eyes to the bandage around her wrist, and something inside her chest seemed to break open and grow warm at the same time. Then she realized, with a clarity she could no longer deny, that she'd fallen in love with this man. She loved him not because he'd arrived in time tonight. She loved him because he'd known every terrible truth about where she came from for weeks, and he hadn't used any of it to demand something in return. Then, almost immediately, another thought came to her, and it unsettled her so deeply that she pulled her hand away. She asked whether that meant someone had been sitting in a car every day for the past 2 months, recording where she went and what time she returned. Rafe said yes. She asked whether he'd ever intended to tell her if tonight hadn't happened. He said no. Maren was silent for a long while. Then she told him she was grateful to him, truly, and that she hated what he'd done, also truly, and she didn't know where to place those two feelings within the same evening. Rafe stood, closed the first aid kit, and told her she was free to hate it, because he wasn't going to change the way he did things. Then he paused at the door, turned back to look at her, and said she should eat something anyway because she hadn't eaten since noon. With that, he walked out, leaving Maren alone with her bandaged wrist and the thought that he even knew she hadn't eaten since noon. Sienna Vaughn had known about the marriage from the day the announcement was released, and for 2 full months, she hadn't given it a second thought, because everyone in their world understood exactly what it was. One name placed beside another, signed 1 month and torn apart the next. She changed her mind in the course of a single afternoon. That day, the two families were meeting at Arthur Hollis's office, and midway through the discussion, Rafe's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, excused himself from the room, and stepped into the hallway to answer it. The call lasted less than a minute, but Sienna, standing behind the glass door, saw the way his shoulders lowered when he heard the voice on the other end, and she saw him say something very brief, then smile to himself before ending the call. She'd watched that man long enough to know he didn't smile at a contract. That evening, she called Yvette Sloan. The two women spoke for exactly 1 hour and reached a very simple conclusion. The dangerous thing wasn't the marriage certificate. The dangerous thing was that the other woman had found her way inside him, and once he began to trust her, everything they'd built could start to crumble. What they needed wasn't to drive Maren out of that house. What they needed was to make Rafe afraid to trust her ever again. The file was prepared over 11 days. There was nothing elaborate about it. It contained 3 photographs of Maren standing at the entrance to a riverside warehouse belonging to the Castellan family, taken from a distance and dated 2 weeks apart. It contained a statement from an account opened under a name nearly identical to hers, showing 2 deposits received on those exact dates. And it contained screenshots of a series of text messages from an unnamed number, their contents so concise that no explanation was needed, discussing train schedules, warehouse departure times, and a shipment bound for Baltimore. The truth was that Maren had stood at the entrance to that warehouse 3 times, because on each occasion the dispatch team had sent someone to meet with a loading contractor that shared the premises, and since she was the newest employee, she was the one they sent. Angelo placed the file on Rafe's desk on a Thursday evening. He said its source was unclear, that it had been delivered through an intermediary attorney, and added that he hadn't finished verifying it. Rafe read the entire file in 15 minutes without asking a single question, then told him to call her downstairs. Maren came down still holding her root notebook. He pushed the papers toward her and asked what the 3 photographs were. She looked at them, then answered immediately that the warehouse belonged to the loading contractor leasing space there, that she'd gone there according to the team schedule 3 times, and that she'd signed the entry and exit log. He asked who had sent her. She said the shift supervisor. He asked for a name. She said she only knew that everyone called him Mac. And the moment the words left her mouth, she realized how terrible the answer sounded. He turned to the account statement. She said she'd never opened any account except the one where her wages were deposited, then gave him the bank's name and the final digits of the account number, and invited him to have his people investigate it. He turned to the text messages. She said she hadn't sent them. He asked whether she could prove it. Marin opened her mouth, then stopped. She couldn't prove it. She didn't possess the warehouse entry log because it was held by the other side. She had no way to prove she didn't own an account she'd never even heard of. She had no way to prove she hadn't sent messages from a number that wasn't hers. Standing there, she understood something chilling. Whoever had constructed this had done it with extraordinary care, because everything in it concerned things whose absence couldn't be proven. She said only one thing to him, that she hadn't done this. Rafe looked at her for a very long time. He didn't say she was lying. He didn't summon anyone. He didn't order her out of the room. But he didn't say he believed her either. He merely closed the file, rested his hand on it, and told her to go upstairs and rest, that she should report to work as usual tomorrow. Marin climbed the stairs, and somewhere along the way, she realized her hands had gone ice cold. Rafe remained alone in the study for a long time afterward. He didn't open the file again. He only stared at it, then called Angelo in and ordered him to retrieve the footage from the warehouse entrance on those 3 days, to do it quietly, and to let no one know. The next morning, Enzo called Marin into his room before she could leave the house. He didn't ask about the file, though everyone in the house already knew that something had happened the night before. He simply told her to sit down, then pulled open the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet beside his bed, took out a small tin box, lifted the lid, and removed a tarnished copper medallion bearing the image of St. Christopher, its broken chain mended with thread. He laid it in his palm and sat staring at it for a while, so long that Marin thought he'd forgotten she was there. Then he looked up and asked her just one question, whether she was afraid of cold weather. Marin almost gave him a casual answer, something like everyone was afraid of the cold. But the question touched something inside her that made it impossible to joke. She said she was. She said she was so afraid that every winter she slept beneath 2 blankets, whether the room was warm or not, so afraid that once, while waiting for a train in the bitter cold, her hands had begun to tremble, not from the cold but from something else. She added that she didn't know why. She'd never known why. Enzo nodded very slowly. He said nothing more about the medallion. He didn't explain whose it was or why he'd kept it. He merely closed the lid of the box, returned it to the drawer, and told her to go to work before she was late. That afternoon, news about the Hollis family appeared in the papers. It wasn't an engagement, nor was it any kind of wedding announcement. It was only a party hosted by Arthur at his home, and during his speech, he said that the 2 families had been close for 3 generations, that his daughter had just returned after 20 years, and that the greatest remaining wish of his life was to see his little girl marry the man she'd known since childhood. He didn't mention that Rafe already had a wife. No one in the ballroom mentioned it either. The newspapers used the exact phrase Arthur had spoken as their headline, and by evening, it was everywhere. Marin read it on the train home. By the time she reached the gates, darkness had fallen, and she saw 2 people standing in the courtyard beneath the light by the entrance. Sienna was saying something, her hand resting on Rafe's arm. He didn't remove it. Marin stood outside the gates and watched for exactly 3 seconds, then walked around to the rear entrance. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed and finally told herself the one thing she'd avoided saying for 2 months, that she had no rightful place here at all. She'd signed a piece of paper in exchange for security. He'd signed one in exchange for 12 months. But the woman standing beneath that light was the person he'd spent 20 years searching for. The promise he'd kept longer than any other promise in his life, and no piece of paper in the world could come between them. She thought of the file on his desk, and she understood that if she remained here, it would be used again, and each time, it would place him in a more difficult position before the council, before both families, and before the entire city. Early the next morning, she rose and wrote out a request to terminate their agreement, stating clearly that she was doing so voluntarily, and that she wasn't asking for any payment. Then she signed it. She placed it on the dining table, removed her ring, laid it on top, and went downstairs to say goodbye to Enzo. He already knew before she opened her mouth. He drew a signed check from inside his jacket, pushed it toward her, and told her to take it. She could consider it payment for the 2 months she'd worked at the port, payment for those 20 minutes that afternoon, or anything else she wanted, as long as she took it. Maren refused. She said that if she accepted it, those 20 minutes would have a price, and she wanted to keep them beyond all price. Enzo asked where she would go. She said she would be all right. He asked whether she loved him. Maren was silent for a long time. Then she said that loving someone also meant knowing when to step aside. He took her hand, and his own hand trembled exactly as it had that afternoon on the steps on Market Street. He told her he'd been wrong to pull her into all of this. She said he hadn't been wrong, that the past 2 months had been the first 2 months of her life when she'd been able to sleep without anyone knocking at the door, and that she would remember them for a very long time. She walked out through the gates carrying the same canvas bag she'd brought with her when she arrived. 3 days later, she rented a small room on the south side of the city, on the 4th floor of a building, without an elevator, and found work loading and checking freight during the night shift at a warehouse near the truck terminal, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning, with her wages paid weekly. The note Maren left behind remained on the dining table for 2 days, and Rafe didn't sign it. He didn't send anyone to find her either, because Angelo said she'd rented a room, found a job, and didn't want anyone coming to see her. On the 3rd day, the footage from the warehouse entrance was finally retrieved, and on all 3 occasions when she'd stood there, 2 members of the dispatch team had been with her. There was an entry and exit log, and even the signature of the guard on duty. Rafe held the report in his hands, but it brought him no relief, because what it proved wasn't simply that she was innocent. What it proved was that he'd spent an entire evening looking at her through the eyes of a man passing judgment. That afternoon, he arranged to meet Sienna. He invited her for coffee somewhere quiet, made idle conversation for about 20 minutes, then told her an old story. He said he still remembered the day the 2 of them had slipped away to the lake and she'd fallen into the water, that he'd been the one who pulled her out, and that she'd cried for the rest of that afternoon because she'd lost the bracelet her mother had given her. He told the story slowly, filling it with details, even describing the sunlight and the wooden bridge. Sienna nodded. She said of course she remembered, that she remembered it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday, even the cold she'd felt when he pulled her from the water. Then she added that she still regretted losing that bracelet to this day. Rafe finished the coffee in his cup, spoke a few more words, then left. On the way home, he sat motionless in the back seat and didn't say a single word to Angelo for the entire 20-minute drive. There had never been a lake. No one had fallen into the water. There had been no bracelet and no afternoon like the one he'd described. He'd invented the entire story on the way to the cafe. Sitting there, he understood that throughout the past several months, every time her answers had flowed so smoothly that something stirred uneasily inside him, every time she recalled a detail that even he had forgotten, it hadn't been a memory returning. It had been someone confirming what another person had already told her. That evening, he called Angelo in and told him to reopen the entire laboratory file. Angelo asked how far he wanted him to go. Rafe said all the way to the end. 3 days later, Angelo laid 3 things on the table. The first was that the sample number recorded on the released test result didn't match the number in the laboratory intake log. It differed by exactly 1 character, the kind of discrepancy no one would notice unless they sat down and checked every line. The second was the original sample collection form, the document recording who collected the sample, when it was taken, and who had been present. It had been removed from the records archive, and the withdrawal log named the person who took it as Dr. Simon Vance, the same man whose signature appeared on the test result itself. The third was that during the period before the results were issued, Vance had met privately with Sienna Vaughn 4 times, and exactly 3 days before the result was uploaded into the system, a payment had been transferred into his account. Angelo placed the bank statement on the table. Rafe lowered his gaze to the string of numbers, then straightened in his chair. He told Angelo to bring back the file on the Delaware route embezzlement case. The 2 documents were laid side by side, and the numbers on them matched from beginning to end. It was a service company in Wilmington. The intermediary account no one had bothered to investigate further months ago, because the immediate concern had been dealing with the group of drivers. Angelo said only one thing, that this meant the money used to pay the doctor had been stolen from their own warehouse. Rafe said nothing. He only thought of the 2 neatly typed pages a new employee had sent to Angelo, accompanied by a single line apologizing in case they already knew about it. They'd used his own money to purchase a name, and the only person who'd managed to touch the thread leading back to them was the woman he had just allowed to walk out through the gates of his home. Dr. Vance was invited to come in on Friday evening. He denied everything for the first 10 minutes. When Angelo placed the archive withdrawal log, the sample number comparison, and the bank statement in front of him, he remained silent for a long time before asking whether this would be taken before the medical board. Rafe said that depended on how much he told them that night. Vance confessed everything. He said the person who approached him hadn't been Sienna, but her mother, Yvette Sloan. She had arrived with a complete file prepared in advance, knew the exact day the Hollis family would submit the sample, and even knew the name of the person who would sign for it. He said he'd been required to do only two things: replace the sample and remove the original collection form, and he had done both. Then he added something no one had asked him: that the woman seemed to know more about the Hollis family than the people inside their own home. Yvette Sloan had stayed exactly one step ahead of everyone. From that afternoon, when Dr. Vance failed to answer his phone for the third time, she knew the truth had begun to unravel, and she wasted no time panicking. She called Darlene Doyle, a woman she hadn't contacted in 16 years, then called Marin from an unfamiliar number. She said she knew who Marin was. She said she had every document from the night of February 14th, 20 years earlier, including the name of the hospital, the declaration, and even Marin's real name. Then she added the one thing she knew would work: that if Marin wanted to know why no one had ever come looking for her in 20 years, she was to come that night, alone. Marin stood in her fourth-floor room with the phone in her hand, and she nearly called Rafe. She opened her contacts. Then she thought of the paper she'd signed, the ring she'd left on the dining table, and the sight beneath the light in the courtyard, and she understood that she no longer had any right to call him. She went alone. The warehouse stood beside the river, behind an old container yard, and the only lights burning were in the office area. Yvette was already seated there, with a file and another printed document laid out before her. She didn't waste time. She pushed the file toward Marin and allowed her to look at it for exactly 30 seconds. Just long enough for her to see the name Cecilia Hollis beside her own date of birth, then pulled it back. She told Marin to sign the other document. Marin asked what it was. Yvette said it was a declaration, stating that Marin voluntarily relinquished every right and claim connected to the Hollis family, along with a promise to leave the state within 7 days. She said that once Marin signed it, she could take the entire file and read it as many times as she wished. Marin said she wouldn't sign. Yvette told her to think again, then tilted her head toward the corner of the room, where Darlene Doyle had somehow been sitting all along on a plastic chair. Marin turned to look, but Darlene couldn't meet her eyes. Yvette said Marin already knew this woman, speaking in the voice of someone playing her final card. Marin asked Darlene what she was doing there. Darlene stammered that she'd merely been summoned, that she didn't know anything. Yvette told her that if this wasn't settled tonight, everything from 16 years ago would be dragged into the light, and those words made Darlene lose control. She leaped to her feet and began talking, speaking so quickly that she seemed desperate to empty herself of everything before anyone could stop her. She said she had accepted money. She said someone had brought the child to her back then and told her the little girl had no one left, that she should raise her and money would be sent every month, and she had accepted, signed the papers, and raised her. She said the payments had stopped after 4 years. There had been no warning and no phone call. Nothing came that month, then nothing came the next, and nothing ever came again. She said Ray had still been alive then, and he'd told her they might as well keep raising the girl, so she had silently continued to do so. But from that day forward, the child was no longer a daughter in her mind. She finally spoke the word she had carried inside her for 16 years, saying Marin was an investment someone had left behind before running away, and if an investment became a loss, there had to come a day when it was recovered. Marin stood motionless in the middle of the room. She didn't cry. She merely felt the 20 years of her life fall into their proper places in less than a minute. Every paycheck she'd brought home, every bill she'd paid for them, every time she'd gone without so someone else could have more. None of it had ever been enough, not because she hadn't done enough, but because from the very beginning, they had never counted any of it as love or loyalty. They had counted it as a debt to be collected. She turned to Yvette and told her to give her the paper. Yvette pushed the document toward her and handed her the pen. Marin picked it up, then set it down on the table and said she wouldn't sign. She told Yvette she was mistaken if she thought someone who had never possessed anything could easily be frightened by the threat of losing what she'd never had. Yvette rose from her chair. At that exact moment, the rolling door at the far end of the warehouse flew open. What happened next was over in less than 2 minutes, and this story won't recount it. All that mattered was that when everything became quiet again, Yvette Sloane was being restrained by Angelo's men outside in the yard, while Darlene Doyle remained seated on the plastic chair. Rafe walked straight past all of it until he stood before Marin, and he couldn't say a single word. He only reached for her hand and held it. She let him. The samples were collected on Monday morning at a different laboratory, with attorneys representing all 3 parties present as witnesses, and the results came back 4 days later. Arthur was the one who read them aloud, but halfway through the first sentence, he had to hand the paper to someone else to finish. Both the father and daughter relationship and the mother and daughter relationship were confirmed. Margaret said nothing. She merely stepped forward, raised both hands to Marin's face, and held her that way for a very long time, like someone afraid that if she let go, the person before her would disappear. Marin remained still. Then she spoke, and the first words she managed in a hoarse voice were that she was sorry. Margaret asked what she was sorry for. Marin said she couldn't remember anything. She said she looked at the 2 of them and no image appeared in her mind, no house, no voice, no single afternoon, and she said she was afraid she would disappoint them. Margaret shook her head. She said Marin didn't need to remember today. She said they hadn't waited 20 years to hear her retell the past. They had waited 20 years only to know that she was still alive, and now that she was standing there, everything else could come later. Arthur sank into a chair and covered his eyes with one hand, and he remained that way for a long time before he could finally look up. That afternoon, Enzo had someone bring him over. He didn't enter the living room. He sat on the front steps and asked them to call Marin outside. When she came out, he said nothing at first. He simply took the small tin box she had once seen from inside his coat, opened the lid, and placed the copper medallion in her palm. He said it belonged to her. Marin said she didn't understand. He told her that on that night, someone had removed it from her hand as part of the admission procedure, and he had asked to have it back. He had kept it from that day until now because he had promised himself that one day he would return it to her with his own hands. He said he had asked her a question in his room, and from the moment he heard her answer, he had known. He simply hadn't dared believe what he knew. Marin lowered her eyes to the tarnished piece of copper in her hand, its broken chain repaired with thread, and raised a finger to touch the metal. No image appeared. There was no house, no face, no name. There was only the cold. The cold came first. Cold in her fingertips and in both feet. The cold she had carried with her for 20 years without ever knowing where it came from. Then came the feeling of a button beneath her finger, hard and round, pressed again and again until her finger went numb. Then came a smell, the scent of dried orange peel mingled with stale cigarette smoke, the same scent she had once breathed in on a rainy night without understanding why it made her throat close. Then came the weight of a coat draped around her shoulders, far too large for her, and still warm from another person's body. And finally, there was a voice, the voice of a boy whose voice was still changing, hoarse and urgent, speaking very close to her ear and telling her not to fall asleep. Marin stood motionless on the porch, still clutching the medallion, and lifted her eyes. Rafe stood several steps away, in the same place where he had remained all along without coming any closer. She looked at him and spoke 2 words. She said, "It was you." Rafe didn't answer immediately. He walked toward her, stopped in front of her, and said yes, it was him. He had been 14 years old. He had sat on a bench in the hospital corridor that night, while his father's life was still hanging in the balance, and he had made himself a promise that he had kept for 20 years. He said he had searched for her everywhere, opened more files than he could count, paid more people than he could remember, and then walked past her without recognizing her for 2 straight months, every morning, at his own dining table. He said he had stood there looking at her in his office and hadn't been able to say the one thing she needed to hear, that he believed her. Marin said nothing. She only closed her hand tightly around the medallion until its edge pressed into her skin, and for the first time, she allowed the cold she had carried for 20 years to leave her body. The ceremony was held at the Hollis home on an afternoon near the end of the month. There was no fanfare, only the 2 families, a few close friends and relatives, and a small number of invited reporters. Arthur rose to speak first. He said that 20 years ago, his family had stood in that very place and told everyone that they had lost a child, that throughout those 20 years he had learned how to live with an emptiness inside him, and that today he wished to say only one brief sentence. His daughter's name was Cecilia Marin Hollis, and she had come home. The entire room applauded for a very long time. Marin stepped forward and held the microphone for several moments before she could speak. She said she had carried the name Cecilia from the moment she was born, and she was grateful to have it returned to her. She said that for 20 years, she had lived under another name, lived in a house that had never truly been a home, and worked from morning until night. There had been times when she believed her life held nothing worth telling, but she said it was during those very years that she had learned to stop whenever she saw someone in need, learned that a person didn't have to be wealthy to give something to another, and the person who had learned those things was named Marin. She said she would keep both names, because letting go of either one would mean abandoning half of who she was. When she finished, she started to step back. Rafe walked toward her in the middle of the room, and before anyone could understand what was happening, he lowered himself onto one knee. He said he had spent 20 years searching for a name, that he had always believed he would recognize that person the moment they met again, and that he had been wrong. He said the person he loved wasn't that name. He said it was her. The woman who had sat down on the steps beside an elderly stranger, even though she knew it would cost her job. The woman who had refused a check and walked out through the gates of his home carrying the same canvas bag she had brought inside. The woman who had stood before him and said she hadn't done it, then returned to work as usual the next morning, even though he hadn't been able to say a single word to tell her that he believed her. He said that the last time, they had signed the papers in 10 minutes, and no one had brought flowers, and he was asking for the chance to begin again, this time by asking her properly. He asked whether she would marry him. Marin nodded before she could find the words to answer. From the front row, Enzo rested both hands on his cane and looked at the 2 children he had bound together through a debt, then spoke just loudly enough for her to hear, saying that this time, the boy finally understood. "My girl." Margaret wept. Arthur handed his wife a handkerchief, then turned away to wipe his own eyes. Those 20 minutes on Market Street had cost Marin a job, a place to live, and everything she had in her wallet. In return, those 20 minutes gave her back a name, a family that had waited for her for 20 years, and the man who had spent nearly his entire life searching for her. There are acts of kindness that leave us at an immediate loss. We lose money, we lose time, and sometimes we even lose an opportunity that might have changed our lives. But kindness has never truly been something lost. It is only something we place into the hands of life, without knowing when it will be returned to us. In the end, a person's worth doesn't lie in the name they carry or the house they live in. It lies in the way they treat someone who has nothing to offer them in return. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How did Marin's story make you feel? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We always read and cherish every sincere thought shared from the depths of your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and serenity beside your family. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.